Okay, guys, so I'm about ready to start. Is everyone else ready? Yeah? Okay. So how was Dries' keynote? Good? Yeah? Come on, guys, first day, right? Good. So, I mean, I was there, but if you're doing a presentation right after Dries' keynote, then on the outside, you're like, yeah, interesting. But on the inside, you're just like, ah, But it wasn't really out of fear or nervousness, even though there's a little bit of that. It's more out of excitement. Thanks. Better? So it's more out of excitement. I'm really excited about this talk. Responsive web design is fascinating because it's very rare that a new way of thinking gets introduced into an industry and everyone stands up and says, yeah, I want some of that. Everyone seems to be talking about this in a really positive and constructive way, but there's still a lot we need to figure out. And responsive web design hits a really personal chord with me, because to me, it feels like this is how you're always supposed to make websites. So it's great to come here and talk to you guys about responsiveness. The topics in this presentation have been bouncing around inside my head for about a year, so it's a really nice pleasure to come here and share it with all you people. So thanks for coming. You guys are awesome. Let's quickly talk about me. My name's Lewis Nyman. I'm a designer and a front-end developer. I've been working for Drupal, or with Drupal, for about 2 years, since version 6. Does anyone remember version 6? No, just me? Okay. So I guess it makes me kind of new to Drupal. I work for Capgemini in the UK. Capgemini have been really supportive of this presentation, and they've given me loads of time to polish it, so fair play to them. And if anyone wants to know what it's like to work with some really smart people on some really huge Drupal projects, then come talk to me later. So I've also been working on the Drupal Core Design Initiative with Jeff Burns, where we're trying to get designers more involved with Drupal and contributing back into the community. And I've also been working on the Drupal 8 mobile initiative, where we've been trying to design Drupal's admin interface for small and touchscreen devices. And if you're into that kind of stuff, and I'm sure some people here are, I'm taking part in a panel called Making Drupal Mobile Friendly. That's all about that core initiative. That's on at some point tomorrow. So if you tweet, then these hashtags may be of use to you. Also, my handle is Lewis Nyman. So later, if you're wondering why I didn't mention a certain topic, or you wanted to know why I found the statistics to support a certain conclusion, then give me a shout and I'll try and hook you up. Alternatively, if you just feel like hurling abuse at me, then Twitter works really well for that as well. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about responsive web design. But before I start, can everyone just put their hands up for a second? Everyone in the room? Okay, wait, actually, even better. Can everyone just stand up? Come on, it's the first day. I'm trying to liven you guys up a bit. Okay, so everyone who's never heard of responsive web design before, sit down, apart from when I just mentioned it. Obviously. Okay, so most people have heard about it before. That's great. Now, can you sit down if you've never made a site that you consider to be responsive? Okay, cool. Now, can everyone else sit down if they think responsive web design is really hard? Okay, so you have a lot of people in the room that think it's really easy, right? It's not hard? No, whether you think it's hard. Yeah, so sit down. Okay, so we have some people who have never really heard of responsive web design before. Some people who already have, sorry, you can sit down now. Some people who already have field experience in responsive web design, and apparently some people who are just too smart for their own good. So luckily, this presentation covers some content for all three of those groups, and I'll explain. So we're going to be talking about the past. We're going to look at what we were doing before, and how we devised solutions for problems we had in the past, and why they were good solutions at the time. We're going to look at how our circumstances changed and shifted in the past couple of years, and look at why our old way of thinking is no longer giving us adequate solutions for the problems we now face. We're also going to be looking at the present, the introduction of responsive web design, a new way of thinking about how we design and build websites. We're going to look at how we've even expanded on this philosophy of responsive web design since it was originally conceived, because now it means a lot more than it used to. And we're also going to look towards the future, and we're going to look at how we can push responsive web design even further as our situation continues to shift and change. And I'm going to explore some of the avenues we can go down in order to do that. So after this presentation, I'm hoping you're going to come away with an understanding of the concepts and the philosophy of responsive web design and how to think in a responsive manner. I'm also hoping you'll come away with an understanding of how to begin developing websites that respond in a responsible manner. And I'm also hoping you'll come away with an eye towards the future, thinking like, responsive web design is cool, but we can take it so much further. And this presentation is not going to cover the best way to write media queries and implement them in your site using Drupal. It's not a how to make an iPhone site tutorial, or here's all the ways that responsive images don't work right now. If you're hungry for a more technical kind of content, then I'd definitely check out Creating Mobile-First and Responsive Drupal Themes with Jack Strawn. And if you want to get really down and dirty with implementation, I'd definitely check out Rethinking Responsive Building Techniques in Drupal with John Albin, which is in this very room today. So we start in the past. In the past, we had a web. It was similar to the one we had today, but it was different. It was 960 pixels wide. Now, at this time, we were in a state of transition. We were maturing as an industry. We were learning from established industries of the past. We were taking from them techniques like color theory, typography, and grid-based design. Now, I like to think of this as the Renaissance period of web design, like the Italians in the 14th century, where we're also thinking, how can we learn from what's come before us? How can we learn from classical sources? And you can see some obvious roots of where we borrowed ideas and concepts from other mediums, like the print industry. Some are so deeply ingrained in our ways of working that we struggle under their influence. Terms such as page and fold. These terms have been adapted from other meanings. They come with semantic baggage, which causes problems when people apply the old associations instead of the new. So when we took grid systems from the print industry and applied them to content on the web, we had to figure out how to work with them in a similar way, in a way that applied the same fixed static dimensions of a printed page to the web. Now at the time, this is about 2007, this is the top 10 screen resolutions then. And to get into the top 10, a display resolution usually had to have at least 1% market share. So you can see at well over 50%, we had a large majority screen resolution of 1024 by 768. So at some point, we decided that this width should become our canvas. If the user had a larger screen size, which it was a few people back then they get a little spacing around the design, which is no big deal. But if the screen was smaller, well, screw them, I guess. They can just learn to scroll horizontally, right? So this worked great for a while. It was so easy. We made some really nice-looking sites. But screens were still getting bigger, and a lot more people were seeing spacing either side of the site. Again, not a big deal. But from 2000 to present day, the market share of 1024 by 768 was dropping and dropping. It was no longer a strong majority resolution. So how do we solve this? A wider grid system, right? Problem solved? Should we all just leave now? Well, actually what happened was, instead of a new large majority resolution coming through to replace 1024 by 768, the share actually just got split between a load of different resolutions. So there was no successor to the throne of 1024 by 768. And you can see here, the rise of this white line here, that's the group called Others. That's all the resolutions that couldn't make it into the top 10 combined. And you can see from 2007 to 2011, that is now the highest point in our market share. It's just a collection of all these rejects. So maybe it's just a good idea just to stick to our lowest common denominator still. You know, a lot of people are going to see spacing either side, and that's not the end of the world. But something else major happened to the web industry that added to this fragmentation of screen sizes. 3 new devices were introduced. Can anyone guess any of them? All right, I'll give you a clue.
Today, we're introducing 3 revolutionary products of this class. The first one is a widescreen iPod with touch controls. The second is a revolutionary mobile phone. And the third is a breakthrough internet communications device. So, 3 things: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone.
Okay, so this third device, this breakthrough internet communications device, didn't really get a very big applause as the other 2. It was just kind of one guy going like, woo! But out of all 3 of those devices, that's the one that changed our industry the most. In Steve's eyes, the iPhone was the first device that made internet browsing actually doable without wanting to stick needles in your eyes and in your hands. And looking at what we had back then, he was probably right. So all of a sudden, screen started to get a lot smaller. Mobile web browsing came about in full force. In the iPhone, we had a device in our pockets that was as capable as the one on our desks. And many companies started to follow suit. It was becoming pretty clear that this old way of thinking about the web as a fixed, static page, would not hold up anymore. To think in this way would be deceiving ourselves. And that moves us closer towards the present. And we move towards this introduction of a new philosophy and a new way of thinking. The control which designers know in the print medium and often desire in the web medium is simply a function of the limitation of the printed page. We should embrace the fact that the web doesn't have the same constraints and designed for this flexibility. And that was the opening paragraph of Ethan Marcotte's article, Responsive Web Design. It was a quote from another article written in the year 2000 by John Alsop, titled The Tao of Web Design. And because of the situation we've now found ourselves in, that article has become even more relevant now than when it was originally written 12 years ago. And in his article, Ethan goes on to say, we're designing for mice and keyboards, for T9 keypads, for handheld game controllers, for touch devices. We're faced with a greater number of devices, input modes, and browsers than ever before. And he goes on to reference a discipline from another industry. He took an inspiration from responsive architecture. He noted how architects have begun asking how physical spaces can respond to the needs of the people passing through them. And then he says, this is our way forward. Rather than tailoring disconnected designs to each of an ever-increasing number of web devices, we can treat them as facets of the same experience. So from that, this concept called responsive web design was born, and Ethan suggests a technical implementation of responsive web design that contains 3 main ingredients. Fluid grids with columns that grow and shrink depending on the size of the screen. Flexible images that change their size to fit their containers. And CSS media queries based on the breakpoints of the width of the screen. When their conditions are met, they reflow and modify our layout. They're kind of like basic if statements. If the width is equal to this number of pixels, then apply this CSS instead. So here's a quick example of responsive site in action, the Boston Globe. Now you can see as it gets smaller and smaller, the width decreases, and everything gets smaller and tighter, and the images get smaller and smaller. And when it hits a certain width, which it will, it reflows and changes columns until we're left with a single column for a small screen mobile device. So that's pretty awesome. But I found myself coming back to something. Responsive architecture. What is responsive architecture? The inspiration for this new way of thinking. How is it understood and implemented compared to our own definition of responsiveness? What else can we learn from this discipline and apply to our own industry? So I decided to look into it and pull out some definitions. Flexible architecture adapts to new uses, responds to change rather than stagnating, and is motive rather than static. Responsive environments, spaces that interact with the people who use them. And this is my favorite one. Architecture that is designed for adaptation recognizes that the future is not finite, that change is inevitable, but that a framework is an important element in allowing that change to happen. So all these definitions are very theoretical and wordy and stuff. So to supplement these ideas, I looked to find some real-life examples on the internet, and I made a short video collage of them, which I'll play now.
We're trying to create a new responsive architecture, working bit by bit with materials and systems and interactive computing and new chemistry in order to try to create an architecture which might be responsive. Perhaps an architecture which might know about us and might care about us. Perhaps an architecture which might start in very primitive ways to be alive.
Particular structure is unique in that it can be put together in many, many different ways. The same basic components can be put together thousands of different ways. It is an attempt to create a changeable, flexible architecture. An architecture that can be one thing today and something else tomorrow.
So there are a lot of varied examples in that video. And from all this research, a couple of points stood out. In all these definitions, there's no reference to the technology used or how it's used in any of these definitions, only that it must be flexible. Buildings can respond to environmental change or human change in a variety of techniques and technologies. There's a separation between philosophy and implementation. And if you start to consider this when thinking about our own definition of responsiveness, you can become to realize that responsive web design isn't just about CSS media queries, fluid grids, or flexible images. They're simply an implementation on that philosophy. Responsive web design doesn't have to be based on width, or it doesn't have to be defined in CSS. And here's an example I dug up from 2006 of a site that we'd now call responsive, but it's using a JavaScript library because media queries weren't yet widely available. So we've been doing this stuff for a long time, but with different technology. One other point that stood out. A lot of examples in responsive architecture are intended to respond and adapt to new uses instead of stagnating and being knocked down after they fulfill their original purpose. They intend for people to move through them for decades or even centuries. And what if we start to think of the sites we make in the same way? What if we also made sites that were built to last, that will work, function, and be flexible in 5 years, or 10 years, or 20 years? Sites that are future-friendly. Sites that work on tomorrow's devices as well as today's. So, this whole responsive web design thing really hit home within the community. Designers and developers really took it to heart. I remember when I first read it, it felt like the right way to design for the web. And since Ethan's article was written almost 2 years ago, members of the web community have taken that concept and they've run with it. Mobile first. It's a concept introduced, at least to me, by Luke Grabowski. He's been going on about mobile first for years, and he's got his own talk, so I won't go into it in too much detail, but I'll give you a quick gist. So instead of building a desktop site with all your fancy images and content, and then hacking away at it, and deleting and hiding stuff until you have a smaller format, why not instead think about the basic small screen experience first? Establish the essentials, a solid baseline of everything you need to accomplish the primary objectives of the project, instead of everything you or your clients attempted to throw into it. Then you can build upon this solid baseline and expand on this experience to take advantage of a larger real estate. And why is this beneficial? Why would you change your workings to do it like this? Well, in the last quarter, 2011, traditional PC devices sold 85 million, and smartphone devices sold 158 million. And that's a 85% year-on-year growth on the sales of smartphones. It's pretty clear we're heading towards a mobile future, with more people accessing the web on the go. So when we take this concept of mobile first and apply it to responsive web design, we kind of get progressive enhancement on crack. We start to think of a large screen as an additional capability, like we think of JavaScript or CSS gradients or animations. They aren't required for the basic experience, but if they're available, we should take advantage of them. So that's the gist of mobile first. Start with a baseline experience and build upon it. But we've taken responsive web design even further still. We've augmented it with conditional loading. A great man once said, "Good design is environmentally friendly. Good design conserves resources and minimizes physical pollution." But can we apply this to web design? I think we can. We shouldn't be wasteful. We shouldn't waste bandwidth on something that isn't going to be used. Not only is that our responsibility as web developers, but there's a huge business benefit to websites to keep their page rate really tight. Speed is a feature of a great user experience. And we can prove this in business metrics, a language that all clients understand. Amazon discovered that their revenue increased by 1% with every 100 milliseconds they cut from their page load time. Yahoo found their traffic increased 9% for every 400 milliseconds they cut. And Mozilla found that when they cut loading time by 2.2 seconds, they achieved 60 million more Firefox downloads in a year. So we should definitely be saving our resources. But how do we apply this to responsive web design? One example is responsive images, a solution we're still trying to figure out. The basic concept is, if the image is too big that the device has to scale it down to fit, then we shouldn't be loading all those additional pixels. It's a bit of a waste. And using this image as an example, the size of the image to fit on the desktop is about 200 kilobytes, whereas to fit on an iPhone 3GS, it's about 30 kilobytes. So an extra 170 kilobytes creates between maybe 300 or 1,000 milliseconds of extra load time on a mobile data connection. And that's per image. If there are multiple images, this can add up to a significant loss of business for our clients. So another way we've used conditional loading with responsive web design is with the loading of conditional content. Instead of loading all the information on page load and then hiding it for smaller screens, we can load only the essential content and then conditionally load more content in if there's a lot of room to take advantage of it. And here's an example of a project by Jeremy Keith. He's made a site about cats. And you can see on the initial load, there's a link to go check out more cats. and that takes you to the Google News page for cats, which is my homepage. But if we go back to the page, increase the size, and reload it, all that information from that page has been loaded conditionally. And it's not very complex to do either. All he's doing here in JavaScript is checking the screen width. If it's more than 640 pixels, then he lazy loads this sidebar content in. And I can imagine a lot of uses for this technique. Like, instead of having just a link to your Twitter profile, you could conditionally load in more tweets if there's room to take advantage of it. So another example of conditional loading in responsive design is conditional resource loaders. These are JavaScript-driven loader libraries that allow us to perform tests on the capabilities of the device, like geolocation or CSS animations or rounded corners, and then ask the question, is this going to be used? So I've talked about the conception of responsive web design and how we've already expanded on it with mobile first and conditional loading. But now I want to talk about the future and how we can expand on responsive web design even further. I think in order to do that, we have to talk about mobile. We need to talk about the word. When we say we're designing for mobile or making something mobile friendly, what do we mean? Are we really designing for mobile, or are we just designing for small screens? Surely there's more to mobile than just a small screen, right? Is anyone here brave enough to define mobile for me? No, I struggle. So are we talking about mobile phones? It would be weird if we were. It's a moving target. Look how many times we've redefined the term mobile phone. Is there any guarantee that what we call a phone now will be the same in 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years? It's unlikely. Maybe we're just talking about handheld devices. Do they have to make calls to be considered a mobile? How different would an iPhone be if we just removed the phone app? It's tricky. Are we even talking about the device? I think it's possible that when we say mobile, we don't have to mean the device, but the context of the person using it. What's important to realize is that the user is not sitting at their desk facing a motionless screen. They could be on the bus, sitting in a cafe, or walking back from work. It's almost a device-agnostic way of looking at it. They could have any size device with any combination of capabilities or factors affecting them. They're untethered. The user is no longer handcuffed to a desk. Now, when we think about this definition instead, I think it's natural to think of a small screen like a touchscreen smartphone, because a person on the street doesn't walk around carrying a laptop in their hand. Nobody does this. iStock Photo is really good for this kind of stuff. So that looks uncomfortable. When we're thinking about a person who is untethered from the desk, it's not wrong to think of a device that fits in your pocket with a small screen. But apart from a small screen, what else affects mobile users? Let's think about some other factors that can differentiate from a desktop user. Does anyone here have any suggestions to factors that could affect mobile users? Good, no keyboard? No mouse, yeah? Different input methods, anyone else? Sorry? Power, did you say? Okay, so there's a couple. I came up with a couple as well. The first one is touch. It's hard not to think about touch right now. The iPhone really changed the interface game. With it, we can make really intuitive, action-based interfaces for our products. And we're starting to see a lot of this. Sites that use media queries to assume a touch-based interface just because the screens got really small. So what they do is they make all the links really big and touchy, which is no bad thing, because if you're on a touchscreen, you want the targets to be a certain size, otherwise they're hard to press. But there's a couple of issues with this technique. Not all small screen devices have a touchscreen. Big, massive buttons on this BlackBerry take up a lot of the small amount of space there is. And yeah, there is a small amount of space, because they have to fit a keyboard on that device as well. So there's no obvious benefit to these big fat touchy buttons. Our blind assumptions are detracting from this user's experience. And similar to that, why are we assuming that large screens don't mean touch screens? This guy needs touch-friendly targets too. And our assumptions, based on the working of today's devices, are going to harm our future. So if we take the principles of mobile first and conditional loading here and apply them to the factor of touch instead, well, we'd have to assume the most basic device, no touch. And if we apply conditional loading to that, it's possible to detect touch support with a library like Modernizer. If we detect touch support on a big or small device, we can respond by loading in more resources. We could load a touch-based CSS file only when it's going to be used. So we've got big touchy buttons on small or large screen devices, but only when it's needed. We could also load conditional content on touch devices to support a different interface. Look at how the Google URL shortener site changes the instructions based on the input method. There's nothing wrong with serving different content to different devices here. It makes a lot of sense. So we're also talking about touch. I also started to think about thumbs. A lot of touch-based interfaces are designed differently because a user is using one thumb as a primary input model. You can see here, this is the rough range of one thumb for an iPhone device. And Apple encourages iOS developers to use these tabs along the bottom of the screen because they're close to the thumb. So one thumb is the default amount of thumbs for a touch interface. But what happens if we double the amount of thumbs available to interact with the interface? Can we take advantage of this? In Windows 8, the keyboard splits when the device is in landscape mode. Maybe there are some other uses we can come up with to take advantage of the increased number of inputs in our interfaces. And you would imagine it's really tricky to detect the number of thumbs the user has available. Well, actually, if you're clever, it's a little bit simple. So there's a media query to check for orientation. If we know the device is being held in a landscape mode, we can assume they're holding it with two hands and they have two thumbs available. So that's touch and thumbs. Another factor I came up with was network. This is another variable that I see lumped in with small screen. There are sites that load less assets on smaller screens because they assume that the device is on a mobile data network, which isn't a bad idea, but I see some situations where small screen devices are actually on faster networks, so it's not a reliable assumption. It's also common for large screen devices to be on slow connections, and these distinctions are only going to become more blurred in the future. We have to throw out our assumptions of how current devices work and just base them on what we know. So how do we test for network speed? The W3C is developing a standard called the Network Information API. This allows us to query the bandwidth and the connection of the device. We could use the principle of mobile first here and assume the most basic device and assume the connection is slow by default and conditionally load heavier assets based on the speed of the connection, which is a bit smarter. And this Network Information API is already supported in Android devices. Another variable that I thought of is color, or should I say lack of color. The Amazon Kindles sold more than 1 million devices every week in the Christmas period. These are cheap, desirable devices with very capable WebKit-based browsers built in. And the scary thing is, these devices are getting even cheaper. 4 years ago, the Amazon Kindle cost $400, and today they cost $79. So how long do you think it will be before they're free? And also in this case, the black and white screen isn't a sign of a poor or low-quality device. It's a feature. People buy these things because of the e-ink display. It enhances their reading experience. So what happens when we go to browse one of our sites on this device? Tough readability, low contrast images, poor visual hierarchy due to the design relying only on color to communicate some aspects. In the worst case, parts of the site become completely unreadable, and this shouldn't be too hard to fix. There's a media query to check if the device is a monochrome screen. We can use this to respond to the differences here and improve the readability and usability. But wait a second, haven't we seen this before? Are we setting styles for color displays and then just undoing them later for non-color displays? Shouldn't we be applying the mobile first principle here and design for the most basic device? So if we begin and assume no color and then detect color, we can add color styles. We can use a color media query here. We can also apply the principle of conditional loading to color. If we detect color support, then we can load a color CSS file that contains that styling only when it's going to be used. We can also add this variable to responsive images. Here's a PNG of the IE7 logo, personally my favorite logo. Here's the same PNG converted into grayscale. Look at the file size difference. Grayscale pixels require a lot less information to store than color pixels. And remember, we should only be loading what's going to be used. We shouldn't be wasteful and load color information if the device isn't even going to use it. If we're going to be resizing images on the fly, we should also have the ability to convert these images to monochrome. So that's color. So one of the problems with smartphones nowadays is they keep swallowing up all my other devices to create a kind of all-in-one device. I used to just text and make calls on my crappy Nokia phone, but now I can check emails, listen to music, take photos. And one of the problems with this is I only have one battery to support all these tasks. We now use phones as wayfinding devices when we're stranded and to find out information when we have no other source. A limited battery life is another factor that is unique to mobile devices. Users probably won't appreciate your fancy animations and gradients if all they desperately want is your information. We shouldn't abuse their battery when it's on its way out. It's a finite resource. So how can we respond to varying battery life in our designs? Maybe we can use the mobile first principle here, assume the most basic device, assume a low battery level until it tells us otherwise. So W3C has a proposal for an API in progress that allows you to query the battery life. You can check to see whether it's charging or not and how long it has left before it dies. An implementation is in the latest version of Firefox, and it's on its way into Chrome now as we speak. And we should turn off our sexiness on our sites when the battery is close to death and do our users a favor. So as well as there being human and device-related factors, there can also be environmental factors. I mentioned before that a mobile user can be anywhere. They could be on the beach, in a cave, in a toilet. The light level varies dramatically. In bright sunlight, websites lack contrast and readability. Wouldn't it be great if we could load a high contrast styling file to give our users a bit of help in this situation? And on the other hand, users can also be in very dark surroundings. All that light streaming in from the screen isn't good for your eyes. You can get some really bad eye strain using these interfaces in the dark. A popular reading app on the iPhone, Instapaper, contains a standard black text on white theme and an inverse theme, white text on black, for reading in the dark. And the developer actually added a setting recently for the themes to be switched automatically at sunset. Would it be great if we could detect ambient light surroundings and offer some help? Apple already does this in iOS, to dim the backlight when it's dark. They also do this in OS X. They use a webcam to detect strong lighting conditions, and they turn off the keyboard backlight to reduce battery drain. So how do we do this in the web? Luckily, the W3C is also developing a sensor API. It provides a template for devices to create their own kinds of sensors. This could be ambient light or motion or temperature. It's pretty cool. And I can't wait to use some of these sensors on the web. So I've talked about the past. I've talked about what we were doing, the solutions we had, and what changed, and why it meant we couldn't continue working the way we were. I've also looked at the present, the introduction of this new way of thinking about how we design and build websites, responsive web design. We also looked at how we've expanded on it already with mobile first and conditional loading. And I've also mentioned a lot of ways we can progress responsive web design today. We can redefine mobile first beyond simply screen size to account for other factors that affect mobile users, and we can leverage conditional loading to create faster interfaces. So I've mentioned some variables we can adapt to today, like color and touch and the number of thumbs. But I've also mentioned other variables like network connection and battery and ambient light, which currently we aren't able to query on today's devices. So why did I bother mentioning them if we can't use them? Because I believe that we should face forward and pull the future towards us. We can communicate with browser vendors really easily nowadays. If we can tell them what we need in order to make a better experience for their users, they need to help us. Because if we choose not to support their products, they'll be worse off. If we say nothing, we might not get all these tools for another 5 or 10 years. So we should speak up about it. And to prove that point, I'm going to leave you with a short story. It's the history of the media query. So back in 2001, the W3C originally published a spec for the media query. If that seems like a long time ago, I'm going to surprise you. In 1998, the HTML4 spec actually foresaw the need for a media query syntax. And that was in 1998. That's 14 years ago. So anyway, the spec gets refined for a couple of years. And then in 2003, Opera implements media queries, which is great. You know, Opera's a really great browser. It's just a shame that no one else uses it. I like those guys, really. And then for 4 years, nothing happens. And then, 2008, Safari implements the spec. So now we've got about 5% of desktop browsers that support media queries. Yay! And then 2009, Firefox implements media queries. And boom, we've got a decent amount of support, maybe close to 50%. And then 2010, we had Chrome and IE catch up. So we had to wait 7 years for one browser implementing media queries for the rest of them to catch up. And maybe it's just me, but it seems like a fucking long time, right? Imagine how quickly we could have had media queries if we kicked up a fuss about it, if we asked for them. We could have had this tool a lot sooner. So let's not let this happen with our new tools, with the battery API, the sensor API, and the network interface API. If we want to be able to respond to these different factors that are already affecting mobile users, then we need to let them know about it. We should think about the now, sure, but we should also face forward and try and pull the future towards us. That's the end. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions, by the way? No? Oh, yeah. Sorry? If anyone has any questions, there's a microphone in the middle. You can queue up there and ask whatever you want. I think I've been let off.
I've got a question about selling clients on this kind of design.
Yeah.
I'm a freelancer, but I work a lot with the same clients that respond to RFPs all the time, and I'm trying to get them away from promising IE7 support, right? So I'm trying to pull the future toward me, but I keep falling into the grave of what should be dead and dying technology. So I don't know if you could talk about the business case for some of this, because we've still got a lot of clients that want a separate mobile site from their desktop site, and they're stuck in that paradigm.
Oh, definitely. I mean, if you manage to convince the clients that there's a benefit to not all sites looking the same, then you can still support IE7, but to a lesser extent. And that's really hard to do because clients get really used to being handed a printout of how websites should look, and then you have to implement it. But if you convince them that if it's actually more beneficial for them financially to make websites look different because you can increase the speed, right? If you have to load all these additional things just to make IE work, then actually they get a better conversion rate, which helps with IE. But as opposed to M.dot versus a regular desktop site, it's tricky because you have to convince them that there are so many devices that you really can't separate them into two different sections. There's so much more in between. And if you can convince them of that, then you'd have more success.
Thanks.
That's right.
Sorry, I didn't see the microphone.
Hi.
You say if we put on pressure, that we will see that these things are implemented faster, and I'm interested in what...
Sorry, can you just speak up for a sec? Is that mic? Is it on?
I'm interested in what methods we have for putting on pressure in order to be able to
Onto browser vendors.
increase the implementation of these services.
Well, you can submit bugs. Anyone can email into the W3C mailing lists to get them to give them a kick for some of these standardization techniques, because it does take time. But really, most browser vendors are very open. You can find them all on Twitter. And they do respond, they do talk to the community, but if they don't know what we want, then they're never going to prioritize it.
Okay.
I hope that helps.
So to reach out both to the developers of the browser developers as well as to W3C?
Oh, definitely, yeah. Because if the W3C invents a spec, it's useless if the browser vendors don't implement it, right? And then even if they do implement it, it's useless if we don't use it. So really, the power is in our hands.
Okay. Thank you.
That's right.
I just wanted to make a quick announcement about a responsive design BOF that's happening right after this session in room 208. And I just want to have a conversation with everyone regarding workflow, project management, and some of the challenges regarding estimating responsive projects. Thanks.
Yeah, if anyone's more interested in continuing the conversation, definitely let's go to that BOF and talk about it. So when is it ending, sorry?
It's right after this session.
Okay.
Room 208. 208?
208.
I think they're just up on the left outside the conference area.
Hey, Louis, you talked about conditional content loading, and I find that to be a problem a lot of times. When you've got a responsive design and you're stretching it around,
Sure.
content can kind of get holes and gaps, and so as your viewable area decreases, I like to either have more content or less content. And I'm wondering if there's some kind of best practices in Drupal where you store different amounts of content. What are you doing?
In Drupal, I don't know. And you'll be better off asking John Albin in his talk, which is on later today. But in terms of the future, I mean, Drupal 8 will be geared for doing exactly that kind of stuff. Whereas Drupal 7 isn't really designed to load different bits of content conditionally.
Have you seen people putting different sort of fragments of content in different fields? Or, I mean, I almost kind of wish there was like,
So I've seen
one.
I've seen a pretty good use case for showing content differently on a small screen device, splitting it up into multiple pages and stuff like that on M.dot sites. But there's no reason why we can't do that in responsive design. There's no reason why we need a different URL to do that.
Yeah, I would definitely like to see that. I'm just curious if other people are using multiple fields for different types of content or what.
Yeah,
But,
definitely,
all right.
definitely go to John Albin's talk.
Thank you.
It's all right.
Okay, so you've definitely opened my eyes, even today, with the monochrome versus the color.
Yeah.
And that got me to thinking, doesn't this all come back to just SVG? And you're saying we should go talk to the web browser makers. It seems like, to me, we could take care of all these crazy issues with scaling images, monochrome versus color if we went to SVG.
Oh,
Because for the
SVG, yeah.
designer, this is insane.
I mean, its support isn't great, but there's no reason why you can fall back to a PNG for browsers that don't support it. But you're never going to be able to use SVG for JPEGs, just for PNGs. But I'm surprised that people don't use SVG more, basically. It might just be the Android support.
Well, then, do you have a good process for going through? Because all of a sudden, in my mind, I'm like, well, now I'm going to design my site. I'm going to design it for all these different devices, whether they got touch or not touch, their size or not size, fast or not fast. Got monochrome versus color. I mean, do you have a good process for that?
So
Where to start?
the way that I think about it is to kind of move away from the idea of defining your own device classes and really just let it naturally happen. Like a device could be black and white, be on a fast connection, could be on low battery, or it could be any combination of those techniques. It's more of an organic way to think about the device fragmentation rather than specifying your own classes.
Gotcha. Thanks.
That's right.
Hi.
Hi.
I guess I have sort of a more esoteric question about it, because we have a lot of content these days that's really for consumption, like articles and that kind of thing. And then there's content that you really need a keyboard to make, like when people are writing things or using it in an application-based way. And when do you decide to split apart your site into a separate app for those sort of creationary items versus trying to make all those things that are hard to do in a responsive way, like creating your own blog post and that kind of thing? As an end user, like where's that line moving now?
Are you asking more like, would you split it? You mean saying like have an m.dot site for a particular creation process?
Yeah, so instead of trying to fit everything that your application may do into like a responsive format, moving the more complicated tasks to an application for smaller devices in an app. Are people doing that now? Is anybody doing that now? I don't know. Like it's. I think of it like there's things that are very difficult to do.
Yeah.
Like for an end user on a small device.
Oh, definitely.
Like writing a blog post and inserting images and things that they might do in terms of creating content. And I'm just wondering if anybody's dealing with that sort of in the responsive way, or are we all just making apps for that stuff?
Oh, I think it's definitely possible to create content on a mobile device. It's difficult, and you're going to have to come up with different interface patterns.
Yeah.
But I think it's definitely possible, and especially within responsive design. I don't see the need for a split of a separate m.dot or an application just to respond to a slightly different factor. I mean, what you have to ask is which factor is making it difficult for the user to do this task, and then respond to that factor and bring in whatever you need through CSS, JS, or server-side if you can.
Thank you.
It's okay. Oh wait, I just forgot. I meant to put this slide up so you can bitch about my comment later on the site. Sorry, go ahead.
Hi, my question is regarding determining the business value. So how can we figure out that how much more resources would be required to go for responsive web design as compared to the traditional one?
It's really hard to estimate how long something would take if you've never done it before. So the only thing I can say is like within like the more you do responsive design, the easier we'll get to estimate how long these things will take, because you'll become familiar with the roadblocks you hit, or the all the different things, all the difficulties that you have. It is really hard to estimate.
Okay, but for enterprise level projects, requiring multiple developers, how can you convince your CMO that okay, this is the way to go? And if we add $50,000 more to the project, or have 3 more developers who have knowledge in this, I mean, are there any use cases or business studies that can help?
Yeah, probably best tweet me later, and I'll send you some links to stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Unless there are any more questions. No. Okay. Thanks, everyone.